The flight attendant cleared her throat, sensing that this was spiraling into something bigger than a seating dispute. "Ma'am, I need you to take your seat," she said firmly. But the woman wasn't done. She turned to the flight attendant, her voice rising slightly. "I don't feel comfortable sitting near him." The air in the cabin grew even colder. Captain Carter's grip tightened on the armrest. He had seen this before, people hiding behind words like uncomfortable to justify something much deeper, much uglier. The flight attendant exhaled, clearly frustrated. She looked at Captain Carter, then at the woman, as if weighing her next move carefully. Passengers around them were still watching, waiting. And then, just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any more intense, a voice from the back of the plane cut through the silence. "Excuse me, but I think you're the one who needs to move." Every head turned toward the source of the voice. The tension had reached its peak, but what happened next, no one on that flight would ever forget. All eyes turned toward the back of the plane, searching for the person who had just spoken. A man in his late 50s, dressed in a sharp navy suit, slowly stood up. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his presence carried an air of quiet authority. He took a step forward, his gaze locked onto the woman who had caused the commotion. "I've been sitting here watching this unfold," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I have to say, it's disturbing." The woman's face flushed. "I was just—" "No," the man interrupted, shaking his head. "You weren't just doing anything. You singled out a man who has served this country, and for what? Because you didn't seeing him here." The cabin remained eerily silent. Some passengers avoided eye contact, others nodded in quiet agreement. Even the flight attendant seemed relieved that someone had finally said what so many were thinking. The woman's posture stiffened. "I have a right to feel comfortable in first class," she said defensively. The man let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Comfortable?" He glanced at Captain Carter, then back at her. "Let me tell you something about comfort. He stepped closer, his voice unwavering. "I served in the Air Force. My father served before me. And let me tell you, there is nothing comfortable about war. There is nothing comfortable about spending months, years even, away from your family. There is nothing comfortable about watching your friends make sacrifices so the rest of us can sit here, on a plane, in first class, arguing over comfort. The woman's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. A heavy silence filled the space between them. Captain Carter hadn't moved. He was still sitting, still watching, but something in his chest tightened. He wasn't used to people stepping in like this. Not in moments like these. The man turned to the flight attendant. "If anyone should be reconsidering their seat, it's not him," he said, nodding toward Captain Carter. "It's her." A few passengers murmured in agreement. Someone near the window clapped softly. Another person let out a quiet, "That's right." The woman's expression darkened. "I paid for this seat," she snapped. The flight attendant, who had remained silent until now, straightened her shoulders. "And so did he," she said, her voice carrying more authority this time. The woman clenched her jaw, looking around the cabin as if searching for someone to take her side. But no one did. A businessman avoided her gaze. A young mother shook her head slightly. An elderly man sighed and looked out the window. She was alone in this. The tension in the air was suffocating. Captain Carter finally exhaled, slowly, measuring his words before he spoke. He wasn't looking for a fight. He never had been. But he also wasn't about to let this moment slip away without making something clear. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but unshaken, "I didn't come here looking for trouble. I came here to get home, just like you." He paused, letting his words settle. "But the difference between you and me? I've spent my life making sure everyone including you, has the freedom to sit wherever they choose." The woman's lips pressed together into a thin line. It was clear she wanted to say more, to argue, to push back, but something held her back. Maybe it was the eyes of the passengers around her. Maybe it was the weight of the moment finally sinking in. Or maybe, just maybe, she realized she had already lost. The flight attendant shifted, glancing between them. "Ma'am, we need to prepare for takeoff. Please take your seat." The woman hesitated, staring at Captain Carter as if expecting him to back down. But he didn't. He didn't have to. Slowly, without another word, she turned and dropped into her seat, her face unreadable. The flight attendant nodded, then stepped away to make final preparations for departure. The murmurs in the cabin faded. The passengers settled back into their seats, the tension still lingering in the air. Captain Carter leaned back, closing his eyes for just a moment. He had fought many battles before, but this was different. And it wasn't over yet. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but the tension still hung thick in the air. Captain Carter kept his posture straight, his hands resting calmly on the armrests, but inside, his thoughts were racing. He had faced hostility before, on foreign soil, in high-stakes missions, even in moments of deep personal loss. But there was something about this moment that felt different. Maybe it was the setting, maybe it was the silence from those who had watched it all unfold, or maybe it was the lingering question in his mind. Asterisk. Would this have happened if he weren't in uniform? Asterisk. The woman sat stiffly in her seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She wasn't looking at him anymore, nor at anyone else. It was as if she wanted to disappear, to pretend none of it had happened. But it had happened, and everyone on that plane knew it. The flight attendant returned a moment later, her face unreadable. She crouched slightly next to Captain Carter's seat, lowering her voice. "I just want to say, I'm sorry you had to deal with that." Captain Carter gave a small nod, appreciating the gesture. But before he could respond, another voice cut through the moment. "Excuse me," the man in the suit from earlier spoke up again, this time directing his attention toward the flight attendant. "Has the captain been made aware of what just happened here?" A few passengers shifted in their seats, sensing that things weren't quite over yet. The flight attendant hesitated. "Sir, I think he should know," the man pressed. His tone wasn't aggressive, but it carried weight. An officer in uniform being disrespected like that's not something we just let slide. A murmur spread through the rows. The businessman near the front nodded in agreement. The young mother who had been watching intently earlier leaned forward slightly, her fingers gripping the armrest. Even the elderly man by the window finally turned his head, his expression unreadable but present. Captain Carter remained silent, watching the situation unfold in front of him. He didn't ask for this. He didn't seek attention or expect special treatment. But he also knew that silence, in moments like these, had a power of its own. The flight attendant stood, glancing toward the cockpit, clearly conflicted. Then, without another word, she walked briskly toward the front of the plane. The woman in question tensed at this, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. "I didn't do anything wrong." Another murmur rippled through the cabin. Someone let out a quiet chuckle, not of amusement, but disbelief. Captain Carter turned his head slightly, just enough to look at her. His voice was quiet, steady. "Ma'am, I hope one day you understand what just happened here." She scoffed but didn't reply. Minutes passed, but they felt like an eternity. Then, just as the plane doors were being secured for departure, movement came from the front of the cabin. The flight attendant had returned, but this time she wasn't alone. A second uniformed officer, one of the airline crew, stepped forward. His face was serious, his eyes scanning the scene as he took a deep breath. "The captain has been informed," he said, his voice loud enough for several rows to hear. He turned his gaze toward the woman. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me." The entire cabin went still. The woman's face drained of color. "What?" she asked sharply. "You need to step off the plane," he repeated, his tone professional but firm. "We cannot allow a passenger to make others feel unwelcome. especially when that passenger is one of the very people who serve to protect this country. Captain Carter exhaled slowly, watching as the moment unfolded in front of him. He hadn't asked for this outcome, but in some way, it felt like justice was being served. The flight was supposed to be just another routine trip for Captain James Carter, a decorated Army officer returning home after months of service overseas. Dressed in his neatly pressed uniform, he quietly made his way down the aisle, his first-class ticket in hand, ready for a rare moment of comfort before reuniting with his family. But what should have been a smooth, uneventful boarding experience quickly turned into something far worse, something that would test his patience, dignity, and resilience in ways he never expected. As he settled into his seat, a woman a few rows back narrowed her eyes at him. At first, he thought nothing of it. Perhaps she had mistaken him for someone else. But within moments, she stood up, her voice sharp and unwavering, calling over a flight attendant. The other passengers turned their heads, sensing the tension. "There must be a mistake," she said, her tone laced with disbelief. "This man shouldn't be in first class." The flight attendant hesitated, glancing at Captain Carter, then back at the woman. "Ma'am, he has a ticket for this seat," she said politely, trying to diffuse the situation. But the woman wasn't satisfied. "No," she insisted, crossing her arms. "I paid a lot of money for my seat, and I don't feel comfortable sitting near someone like him." A heavy silence fell over the cabin. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, making it painfully clear what she meant. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Captain Carter, however, remained composed. This wasn't the first time he had encountered ignorance, but it still stung. He had fought for his country, sacrificed time with his loved ones, and put his life on the line, all so that people like her could live freely. And now here he was, being treated like he didn't belong. The flight attendant looked torn, unsure of how to handle the situation. And then something unexpected happened. Captain Carter took a deep breath, sat up straight, and turned to face the woman. His response was so powerful, so deeply moving, that by the time he finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye on the plane. What did he say? What happened next? Stay tuned, because this is a story you won't want to miss. Captain Carter turned slowly, his steady gaze meeting the woman's cold, unrelenting eyes. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the silence in the cabin growing heavier by the second. Every pair of eyes in first class, and likely even beyond, was locked onto him, waiting to see how he would respond. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between maintaining order and addressing the blatant disrespect. But Captain Carter had faced far greater challenges than this. His years in the military had taught him patience, restraint, and most importantly, the power of standing tall in the face of adversity. "Ma'am," he finally said, his voice calm but firm, "I assure you, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The woman scoffed, shaking her head. "People like you don't belong in first class," she muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. A quiet gasp rippled through the cabin. A man a few seats away shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. A young woman near the window glanced between the two, eyes wide with disbelief. No one spoke up, perhaps out of shock, perhaps out of fear of escalating the situation, but the tension was thick, unrelenting. Captain Carter took a deep breath, reminding himself of who he was. He wasn't just any passenger. He was a man who had served his country with honor, who had seen battlefields most people could never imagine, who had watched his brothers in arms make the ultimate sacrifice. He had faced enemies in combat, but this was a different kind of battle. Still, he refused to let anger take hold. He had learned long ago that dignity speaks louder than rage. "I fought for this country," he said, his voice steady. "I've spent years away from my family so people, all people, can have the freedom to travel, to work, to live as they please." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. "I earned this seat, just like you did." The woman opened her mouth as if to argue, but something in his tone made her hesitate. For the first time, her expression faltered. A murmur spread through the cabin. A man in business attire glanced at Captain Carter, then back at the woman, shaking his head in quiet disapproval. Another passenger, an older woman, gave him a small nod of encouragement. The woman's mouth opened and closed, as if searching for the right words, but none came. The reality of the situation was settling in, and for the first time, she looked uncertain. Passengers watched in silence, waiting, watching. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The woman's face twisted in disbelief. Her fingers gripped the armrests as if anchoring herself to the seat. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice a mix of anger and desperation. "I paid for this seat. You can't just remove me." The airline officer remained calm. "Ma'am, if you don't come voluntarily, we'll have to call security." A wave of hushed whispers spread through the cabin. A few passengers exchanged glances, some looking satisfied, others simply stunned by how quickly things had escalated. The woman's eyes darted around, as if searching for someone to defend her, but no one spoke up. Then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, Captain Carter shifted in his seat. His voice, though quiet, carried enough weight to make everyone pause. "Wait," he said. The airline officer turned to him surprised. The woman froze, staring at him with a mix of suspicion and confusion. Captain Carter exhaled, measuring his words carefully. "I don't think she needs to be removed." A ripple of shock moved through the cabin. Even the businessman who had spoken up earlier raised an eyebrow. The flight attendant hesitated, looking between them. The woman, for the first time, seemed completely speechless. The airline officer furrowed his brows. "Sir, with all due respect." "I appreciate what you're doing," Captain Carter interrupted, his tone steady. "And I won't deny that what happened was wrong. But forcing her off this plane, that's not the lesson she needs to learn." Passengers shifted in their seats, hanging on to his every word. Some looked confused, others curious. Captain Carter turned to face the woman directly. "You wanted me gone," he said. "You didn't think I belonged here. But I do. And so do you." He let the words settle before continuing. "I could let you be removed, let you walk off this plane humiliated. But what does that really change?" The woman swallowed, her expression unreadable. He leaned forward slightly. "I've been in places where people truly didn't belong, on battlefields where the difference between life and death was a matter of seconds. I've seen people sacrifice everything for strangers they've never met." He paused. "So if you really believe I don't deserve to be here, then take a good look at yourself and ask, do you?" The silence that followed was heavier than before. The woman's fingers twitched on the armrest. She looked around again, but this time it wasn't for support. It was different now. The weight of what had happened seemed to settle on her shoulders, pressing down with a force she hadn't expected. The airline officer cleared his throat. "Sir, are you saying you'd prefer she stays?" Captain Carter nodded. "I'm saying she has a choice. She can stay in that seat, take this flight, and think about what happened today. Or she can walk off this plane and carry this moment with her for the rest of her life." The woman's breath hitched slightly. The entire cabin felt like it was holding its collective breath, waiting to see what she would do. Would she walk away in anger? Would she stay and confront what she had done? The decision was hers, and everyone was watching. The woman's hands tightened on the armrests. Her face, once filled with defiance, now flickered with something else: uncertainty. The weight of Captain Carter's words hung in the air, pressing down on her as the entire cabin waited. No one spoke, no one moved. The choice was hers, and she knew it. Her eyes darted toward the aisle, then back at Captain Carter. A part of her wanted to lash out again, to hold on to her anger, to refuse to admit she had been wrong. But there was something in the way he looked at her, not with resentment, not with triumph, but with quiet dignity. He had given her an out, a moment of grace she hadn't earned, and that made it even harder to ignore. The airline officer stood firm. "Ma'am, what's it going to be?" A long silence stretched between them. Then finally, with a sharp exhale, she released her grip on the seat. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she settled back. "I'll stay," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. A quiet murmur rippled through the cabin. The airline officer studied her for a moment, then turned to Captain Carter. "If you're sure about this, Captain Carter gave a small nod, unsure. The officer hesitated before stepping back. The flight attendant nodded and moved toward the front of the plane, signaling to the crew that the situation had been resolved. The air was still heavy with tension, but something had shifted. The woman didn't look at Captain Carter. She stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable. But something had changed in her posture. She was no longer rigid, no longer holding on to the same sense of entitlement that had fueled her actions minutes ago. Whether she realized it or not, the moment had left its mark on her. The cabin slowly returned to normal. Passengers settled into their seats, some still stealing glances at Captain Carter, others murmuring among themselves. The businessman from earlier gave him a nod of approval. The young mother near the window wiped at her eyes. Even the elderly man who had remained silent throughout the ordeal turned and spoke, his voice low but firm. "Handled yourself well, son." Captain Carter gave a small, appreciative nod, but said nothing. He wasn't looking for praise. He was just ready to go home. The engines roared as the plane finally taxied down the runway. The tension was fading, replaced by the usual quiet hum of travel. Captain Carter closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. Then, just as he was beginning to relax, a voice beside him broke the silence. "Thank you." It was barely audible, almost swallowed by the noise of the plane. He opened his eyes and turned his head. The woman was staring straight ahead, her fingers fidgeting in her lap. She still wouldn't look at him, but the words had been real, and that was enough. Captain Carter said nothing. He simply nodded, then leaned back in his seat. The plane lifted off into the sky, carrying them forward, not just to their destination, but towards something greater. Captain Carter didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. The simple acknowledgement, however quiet, was enough. The woman shifted in her seat, her fingers still restless, as if struggling with something she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was understanding. Maybe, for the first time, it was the realization that not everything had to be a battle. The plane cruised smoothly above the clouds, and the tension that had once filled the cabin had all but disappeared. The flight attendants resumed their service, passengers returned to their books, their movies, their quiet conversations. But there was still a lingering energy in the air, a shared understanding that everyone on that flight had just witnessed something they wouldn't forget. A few rows ahead, the businessman who had first spoken up caught Captain Carter's eye again. He gave a small nod, a silent sign of respect. The young mother smiled softly before turning her attention back to her child. Even the elderly man who had been watching everything so carefully had closed his eyes, settling into the flight as if, for the first time, he could relax. The woman beside Captain Carter stayed quiet. She kept her gaze forward, but every so often she would take a small breath, as if she were replaying everything in her head. He didn't push her to speak again. People learn at their own pace, and change, if it ever comes, doesn't happen in an instant. The flight continued without incident. Drinks were served, the soft murmur of conversation filled the cabin, and soon the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach to the destination. As the plane began its descent, the woman finally turned to look at him. There was no hostility in her expression now, no arrogance, just a hesitation, like she was still searching for the right words. "I was wrong," she finally said, her voice low. "About you. About a lot of things." Captain Carter studied her for a moment, then gave a simple nod. "Safe travels," he said, leaving it at that. The plane touched down smoothly. As passengers gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, the woman hesitated once more before standing. She didn't say anything else, But before she stepped into the aisle, she gave one last glance in his direction. It wasn't much, but it was something. Captain Carter stood, grabbed his bag, and made his way toward the exit. As he stepped onto solid ground, the weight of the flight slowly lifted from his shoulders. Another journey ended, another lesson learned, and for one passenger on that plane, maybe, just maybe, a new one had begun.